you know I'm here, and I'm the director of the Israel Action Center at the JCRC in Greater Washington. The JCRC is the public affairs and community relations arm of the Jewish community of Greater Washington. We are the, sorry, I already said that. I'm also nervous. We represent the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington and more than 100 Jewish organizations and synagogues throughout the region. One of the 4 pillars of the JCRC's work is strengthening the U.S.-Israel relationship. Our Israel Action Center continues to expand pro-Israel grassroots advocacy throughout Maryland, Virginia, and D.C. We are proud to bring educational advocacy opportunities throughout the year and are especially excited about our 3rd Scholar in Residence Week featuring member of Knesset Ayelet Nahmias Verbin. Member of Knesset Ayelet Nahmias Verbin is joining the JCRC from today. She landed just a few hours ago and is exhausted, and I pretty much had to drag her here, so please go easy on her. No, I just mean in terms of the fact that she's very tired. She's here till November 9th, visiting synagogues, universities, meeting legislators and members of interfaith community, and more. We are proud to offer our community these unique and thought-provoking programs which honor the legacy of Rabin and consider a fresh perspective on progressive Zionism. As Pina mentioned, all Israelis who were alive at the time remember where they were on the night of the assassination. I was an 18-year-old who had just returned home from living in London, and I will never forget it. I was just watching TV, but I felt very disconnected from Israel at the time, having not lived there for the past 4 years. And those 3 shots at the square, the Rabin Square, reconnected me to Israel at once. I became part of what was known as the Yaldei HaNerot, the children of the candlelights, of the lights. Children coming together, teens coming together, lighting the lights, singing songs, filling the squares, and really feeling that we've lost a father/grandfather, a big leader. And that's something that really sticks with me till today. As the 20th anniversary of Rabin's assassination approached, we at the JCRC became really introspective and wanted to bring to the community someone who we felt that could understand what Rabin was trying to build, both inside, within Israel, and with her neighbors. And we were very lucky that a member of Knesset Nahmias Verbin is going to do exactly that. So she's here to provide her first-hand insight into Rabin's steadfast leadership, passion for Zionism, political and military contributions to the state of Israel, and his vision for peace in the Middle East. Her discussion of Rabin's aspirations to create peace and justice inside Israel and between the Israelis and Palestinians could not be more timely given the state of Israel, the state of affairs in Israel today. Member of Knesset Nahmias Verbin began her career as an assistant to Rabin shortly before he became the leader of Israel's Labor Party, and continued after Rabin became prime minister in 1992. After the tragic assassination, Nahmias Verbin became the general director of Shalom Chaver, an organization established in Rabin's memory. In 2006, Nahmias Verbin received a distinction from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in honor of her efforts to commemorate Yitzhak Rabin and promote tolerant dialogue in Israel. Since joining the Knesset as a member of the Labor Party in March 2015, member of Knesset Nahmias Verbin has influenced major reforms as an active member of the House Committee, Economic Committee, and Committee on the Rights of the Child. She's also the chair of Lobby for Industry in Israel and chair of Lobby for the Israeli Family. Before we begin, one last final note, I promise. I want to thank our co-sponsors tonight. Americans for Peace Now, AJC Washington, B'nai B'rith International, the Embassy of Israel, Gather the Jews, Israel on Campus Coalition of Greater Washington, Israel Bonds, Jewish National Fund, New Israel Fund, and Stand With Us. Also, of course, want to thank the DCJCC for hosting us tonight, and the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington, and my friend and colleague Pina for their incredible partnership and putting this event together with us here tonight. Final reminder to please turn off your cell phones if you haven't done so by now. And now, finally, without further ado, please join me in welcoming member of Knesset Ayelet Nahmias.
Hi, good evening all. Thank you so much for joining me. I feel kind of weird. I feel I should be closer to you somehow, but it is very strange to stand here 20 years after Rabin was assassinated and to speak to you about his legacy, about his life. Because I've been actually doing that for the past 20 years in Israel, going and speaking to children of all ages about what Yitzhak Rabin was, who Yitzhak Rabin was, what he meant, and what his legacy means. I really want to thank Renat and Tamir for this wonderful exhibition for Israel, are close friends of mine in Israel as well. And I think they're doing marvelous educational work in reference to the incitement that was going on before Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, and unfortunately, in many ways was embraced by the society of Israel instead of being kind of pushed out from conversation, from conflict in Israel. Being here in Washington is kind of closing the circle for me, because when I was 17, I came to the tri-state area and Washington as a delegate for the Israeli Foreign Ministry to speak to youngsters in high schools, churches, and colleges about Israel. And at that time, we were speaking about 1987, you know, sometimes I would come and draw on the board like my name in Hebrew and stuff like that, and people would think that we had camels in Tel Aviv or something like that. Obviously, things have changed. Thank God for Mark Zuckerberg, but it's not just that. It's not just that. I had very, very unique privilege, I have to admit to you. You know, in Israel, a lot of the youngsters, after finishing the army, go to Far East Asia, they put on their backpacks, and they just go a little bit to scout, you know, to find themselves. So I did just that, but it was in the corridors of government, which I didn't know initially. The first time I met Yitzhak Rabin, I came to his office, I still wasn't working for him, and there was something mesmerizing about him. Now, he was, in many, many ways, it was just, you know, he was very shy and embarrassed, kind of, you know, redhead type of guy. At that point, he already had gray hair, but you could see he was redhead in character. And really, honestly, he was redhead, I can tell you that. There was something about him, you know, the je ne sais quoi, something that you can't really grasp about someone. There was leadership there, and I understood that. I was 20 years old. I was a student in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. At that point, I was studying, well, I started off studying law. I was already a business and poli-sci student. And I started working for him. It was very strange at that point, because he was, it was him against Shimon Peres for the first primaries in Israel. And he didn't understand Rabin, I was speaking about. He was, you know, he wasn't the typical narcissist politician. He didn't think, you know, he knew his own value, you know, he knew his own worth, but he didn't think much, you know, he had self-derogatory humor, he was able to laugh about himself. And not many young people were supporting him at that point. It was the first primaries in Israel ever. Unfortunately, it wasn't the last. Being a primarist, you know, being a candidate in primaries myself, I can tell you that's not the best system to choose people. However, not many young people were rooting for him. One of the reasons was probably, you know, Peres was conceived as more of a visionary. You know, he spoke about the human East. Rabin was practical. He was always pragmatic. On the one hand, he was able to take you, personally I felt that he was taking you through a very, very visible vision. I could see where he was aiming for. Peres, you know, was thinking about the new Middle East. He was right to do that, but only the combination of the two could create something that we later know as the government Rabin was heading 1992 to 1995, the Oslo Accords, the peace agreement with Jordan. So you needed a dreamer and you needed a pragmatic person. And I remember, you know, thinking about him personally, I don't always do that. I don't always go to the personal aspects, but it's very, very tempting tonight. And the first time I actually turned to him when I started off working with him, I called him Mr. Rabin. And because I was, you know, there was something, he was chief of staff, you know, he was the chief of staff of the 6 Days War. And he said, you can call me Yitzhak. And breaking the ice just like that. And I started going around in Israel with him to many, many places. I think one of the strongest experiences that I've had that has affected me when I decided to take the plunge and become a politician myself was still primaries. It was winter. We came to Haifa. Shabbat, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. How many people in the room? In the brand, the Labor Party, whatever there. How many people were there? 4 people. Yitzhak Rabin sits down and started speaking to them as if there were 400 people in the room, answering their questions, speaking to them. I think that was one of the strongest experiences that I've had in life. The respect I felt for people. Understanding that even though there are only 4 people in the room, they are echoing. And that's how he echoed his vision. And when he won the primaries, and we went on to the campaign, sense in Israel was that change is needed. I could cry when I'm speaking about the 1992 campaign, especially today, because in the campaign of 2015, I thought that Israel was crying for change. I had the same sentiment when I was going around as a candidate myself, asking people to vote for the Zionist Union, and I felt that people wanted change. And Israel, in many ways, has changed. Israel is still, you can see it in the wonderful exhibition outside. You can see that Israel is still not in mourning, but under the effect of this terrible, terrible assassination. That no matter which way you take it, or from what perspective you look at it, has changed the course of history in Israel. It really doesn't matter where you're trying to look at it. And I remember Yitzhak Rabin being drawn to the people. Now, he was very shy, as I said before, and he was embarrassed when people liked him. He wasn't a small talk master, which is quite interesting because he was very, very fond of American politics and American democracy. He was the ambassador to the Israeli ambassador to Washington. And you can see pictures, you can see pictures next to President Ford, and you can see that he liked being here. Yeah, he was no small talk master. But I remember him going to people, all of a sudden being drawn to the fact that people loved him and the fact that people believed in him. Because when he was speaking about changing priorities, when he was speaking about the option of peace with Syria, about the nonetheless important process with the Palestinians, because he believed that the Syrian channel would advance quicker. It took him by surprise, the fact that the Palestinian route came on first. I think he believed at that point that it's very, very important to get a deal done with Assad Sr. Very interesting to think about, I decided, everybody's asking me all the time, especially in the past month, what would have happened if? And I'm trying not to think about it, even though I read the critic today in the New York Times about Dan Efron's book. By the way, sounds like a fascinating book, so I'm sure you're going to have a fascinating get-together with him. But he's really trying to contemplate what would have happened if. I've stopped doing that. First of all, I don't have a crystal ball. And then again, I would have a crystal ball that has to look back and forth and back. I don't know. I can tell you that a few weeks before the assassination, we have started preparing ourselves for new elections in Israel. It was very, very obvious that the elections are going to take place at the beginning of 1996. And we didn't get there. We didn't get there. I'm trying to think what Yitzhak Rabin would think about Israel today. Not an easy thought. I don't think he would be very, very happy. On the one hand, I can think about things that would have made him happy, such as there are more young people in politics nowadays. I think he would be happy about that, because when people ask me about his legacy, I keep saying his legacy is really kind of Kennedy kind of legacy. Ask what you can do for your country, not what your country can do for you. That was truly him, because he decided to be, even in the hardest days, personal hardest days, he decided to keep on. He was a marathonist. He knew how to run the marathon. When he was walking the political desert and his shoes were filling with sand and being heavy, he still went on. He continued. When things were challenging him, he was still there. He could endure them. That is not obvious for a politician. That is not obvious at all. Because a politician has to take so many difficult decisions. Being prime minister in the 1970s, being a prime minister in the beginning of the 1990s was very, very enduring, and he had to take decisions. What do you mean on a daily basis, on a minute basis? Very, very difficult decisions to take. So I think his strongest legacy is probably what you're doing, Nina and Noah. What everyone's doing is just finding the way of how to make a difference, of how to make an effect. You know, even when I wasn't a politician, I was trying to find my own ways of making a change. I was a woman board member very early on in life, and I was heading the Israeli branch of women corporate directors. I set up a whole community for reserve duty families, which is very, very important to me because my husband is in the Army Corps for many, many years. Always trying to make an effect. I think the fact that I took the plunge and went into politics after all, which was not an easy decision. It's not easy to be a politician. It's not easy to be a woman politician. We have 3 young children, so it's very, very challenging. However, I decided to take the plunge also because of Rabin. It had a major, major effect on my life. I think the fact that I saw, not just that I saw great, because it's not that if you come to Israel, if you come to Tel Aviv, or when you come to Tel Aviv, please let me know, and I will make sure you go to Rabin's museum. Because I think more than anything, that is what he was. This is not a mausoleum, no admiration there, just pure facts saying Rabin and Israel are completely tied, completely woven in together. The history of Israel and the history of Rabin. Rabin was a true Zionist. Being Zionist nowadays is not just about being in Israel. You are 67 years old, very young country, very challenging country. My family has actually been in what is now known as Israel since 1777. Basically forever, right? I'm very proud of that. But my life's mission is to make sure that a promising land becomes a promising country. A promised land becomes a promising country. It's always, but it is what it is. And I think Zionist values are much more than just the fact that we are there. Zionist values are humanity values, are social justice values. That is part of Zionism. It doesn't sound like part of Zionism, I know, but I think that's what modern Zionism is. And we should take that toll, and that toll is not easy, because we are a fragmented society, and being a small country and a fragmented society is much more challenging probably, whereas, big countries also having a hard time dealing with the refugees issues, for instance. So can you imagine a small country such as Israel dealing with that, dealing with the challenges? Can you imagine when Rabin became prime minister for the second time? We were a very young economy. Israel was a developing country at that point. We had 1 million newcomers from the old Soviet Union. 1 million newcomers to a country of the size of about 5.5 million people. No, 5 million at the time. All living in trailers, basically, because there were not enough houses to have them. At that point, the right had invested a lot of resources in the settlements, and also we're tackling the issue of how are we dealing with the Palestinians, because we were in the midst of the first Intifada, the first uprising, which was basically stones, something that we are unfortunately revisiting today. Knives, stones, rocks, basically the same uprising. And decides to freeze up the settlements, the building of the settlements. And he decides to raise the salaries of teachers by 70%. And he goes to America and brings the money that Shamil wasn't able to, his predecessor, wasn't able to bring on because they were not able to agree on what is the vision, basically. What is the vision for Israel? Are we going to continue living in the middle of Intifada? And this is also after the first Iraq War, which also had a huge effect on Rabin. Understanding, realizing that the next war is not armored corps and infantry. It's long-haul missiles. And it brings us to today. Because today, we feel, in many ways, that we have to continue his legacy. And his legacy is a civil one as well as a security one. It is continue the process, the peace process, towards a two-state solution. And making sure that the challenging Israeli society brings about equal opportunities, which sometimes it's very, very hard to detect. It's very funny to think about a state as small as Israel, which is probably the size of what state in America? Probably New Jersey, right? New Jersey. So would you think that New Jersey has periphery? Would you think that it's difficult to get from one point in New Jersey to the other point? Ridiculous, right? In Israel, still today, we're still tackling that issue. From my perspective, obviously, Negev, Galilee, that these are all centers of Israel, but they're not yet well connected and does not yet give equal opportunities to those who live there. And that is a very, very big challenge. On the other hand, thinking about it, can you imagine a country going through the challenges that Israel is going, security-wise, social-wise, and surviving it the way that Israel has done? Becoming a startup nation while going through all of that, while going through all those wars. If I had stuff, my assistant come with me here today. She was building Sderot. Sderot is a small place, small town, down south in Israel, that was rocketed since 2001. When she was there in 2001, they had 3 seconds to get to a shelter. 3 seconds. Most of them never got there. You just had to bet on luck. Can you imagine Mexico rocketing Texas? And living under that threat for so many, many years? So whereas, first of all, I have no privilege of being pessimistic. Shimon Peres has a nice saying about that. He says, there's no difference between the way that a pessimist and an optimist die. The only difference between the two of them is how they live. That is so true. So being an Israeli politician, I really don't have any kind of privilege to be frustrated, being upset. I have to wake up in the morning and think of what I'm doing next. Last week, for instance, I had my first law passed, which is very, very challenging being in opposition. And my first law, which I would not have bet would be the first law to pass in this kind of atmosphere, was the children starting first grade have to learn Arabic. And that was very, very moving. We were all very moved. I won't tell you the tricks. Because there were tricks involved. But you should know the tricks, right? To play the game. So, but I would never have bet that that would be the first law that I would be passing. I had another law coming up last week that hasn't passed yet, which is speaking about equal opportunities for women sitting in panels. I don't know if you have that problem in America. I think you have that problem on boards. In Israel, sometimes you don't see enough women on stage, or you hardly see any women on stage. So that is another law that I hope they will be passing with the help of one of the ministers. We now have an equality minister, by the way, in Israel, which is very, very important. Her name is Gila Gamliel. So there are things turning to our benefit. But still, the challenges are enormous, really, really enormous. I think probably, speaking about 20th anniversary of Yitzhak Rabin's assassination, no doubt the incitement that has been going on in the streets of Israel is very, very concerning. As I said before, we embraced it into our discussion, into our deliberations in Parliament and outside of Parliament, instead of really pushing it out of our lives. You know, when the street was inciting against Rabin, the sedition was horrendous, really horrendous. You can see the pictures here. I can tell you one thing. Look on YouTube. It's so much worse than these pictures. Pictures, still cannot speak. It was terrible. Really, they were flaming up the streets. He wasn't that affected by it. The only time he was really affected by it is when he thought they were hurting his wife, Leah. But one of my strongest emotions looking back is the fact that nobody is standing and saying, stop this incitement. Words can kill. Probably a lot of the people just didn't think that way at that point, in spite of a lot of rabbinical incitement, and rabbis sometimes have a really huge effect on their congregations. Very, very right-wing rabbis. And I keep saying, repeatedly, when I see incitement against the current Prime Minister, for whom I did not vote, he is my Prime Minister. He is my Prime Minister. I will not allow any kind of sedition to take place against him. And there is sedition against President Ruby Rivlin. And that scares me. That scares me because it seems like if you want to be heard, if you want to be a leader that is heard, you have to incite. You have to inflame. Now, we're Middle Easterns. We have temperament. Where does this stuff, right? That's not where we intended to go. And sometimes I find myself, as a politician, being interviewed, and all of a sudden I find myself inflamed. I stop it. I just stop it. And it's difficult for me because the other half of my family come from Salonika, right? From Greece. So we're very, 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 very temperamental. So it's not easy for me, but you have to control yourself. And when I shout in the parliament, which is my job basically, that's what I get paid for. I also have to remind myself to kind of mellow it down. And that's challenging, but I mellow it down because I know it's for a good purpose. It's for the purpose of tolerance. It's for the purpose of practicing giving myself some practice in hearing opinions that I have a very hard time listening to. I think that's being Zionist, being tolerant, being Zionist, because Zionism was always made up of the veterans of the country accepting the newcomers. And when we did not take them in, then from my perspective, we're not being Zionist. Worst of all, we're not being Jewish. Worst of all, we're not being Jewish. And for me, it's very, very, very important to be Jewish, as much as it is to be a strong democracy. I will try and finish it up by speaking about the Israeli democracy, which I spoke quite at length about, and I want to give you the opportunity to ask me any questions that you would like. Being Jewish and democratic is challenging. I don't know why, but it's challenging. I see it's also challenging in America to be a strong democracy. Now in Israel, with the parliamentary system, when it's fragmented, as we are fragmented, we have too many fractions in Israel, it would be much more ideal. When I was growing up, we had, very, very obvious, we had the Labour Party in any kind of form or shape, and you had the right wing. It was easier. I think it encouraged less inflammatory conversation. we have become more inflammatory due to the fact we're fragmented because everybody's competing on attention. And that weakens our democracy. And Rabin's assassination obviously weakened the Israeli democracy. I think about the Rabin family with whom I'm very, very close, and I keep saying to myself, you know, waking up in a country, loving a country where your brother killed your father, your grandfather, your husband, it's very difficult, and not to give up. It's very difficult. But that's what they did. And that's a choice that we have had to make. I spoke yesterday on Mount Herzl. Yesterday was November 4th. And I spoke with my very, very close friends, 300 or 400 of them, we have been walking for a long time with Yitzhak Rabin. And we really, really miss that kind of leadership. I'm trying to hope that eventually hope will prevail. Last week, I met President Clinton in Tel Aviv. And he was speaking at length about the fact that when you wake up in the morning, you have to choose, you have hope and you have fear. And you have to make sure that hope is always stronger than fear. And I don't only love being in Israel, I really, really love being in Israel. I apologize, I love my country so much. Not that I need to apologize, but sometimes I understand why from the outside it's difficult to understand. It's an amazing, amazing, amazing country. But I really, really feel that I'm part of a group that needs to make sure that it stays there, that it grows stronger, that my children and their children will be able to live there. And that is a very, very difficult toll. We're 67. We need to make sure that, you know, sometimes when you look at history, some countries survive for like 100 years, like a century. We need at least a millennium, right? So that's what I'm working on. Thank you.
Thank you for coming here. You said two things. One was that Rabin was pragmatic. Right? As opposed to Paris, who was the visionary. And then you said also that it's very hard to be a woman in politics. So I'm going to ask two questions based on those two comments. First one is, do you think that in Israeli politics, whether on the right or the left, particularly in your party, I'm not asking you to say anything bad about your leader, who was here 2 weeks ago.
I'm going to be here.
Right. Do you think that there is that pragmatic leader? Because a lot of critics of Herzog said that, you know, he's a visionary, but he didn't have any pragmatic answers. And secondly, do you think you can have another woman prime minister in the future?
First of all, we have to have a woman prime minister, but apparently you are going to take us to. You're going to beat us to it, because I'm the president, so. I have to tell you, I've been rooting for her since 1998, when Clinton was still president, and I heard her speaking in Tel Aviv, and I was really wanted to shout Hillary for president, way, way, way before. Herzog is a pragmatic man. It's just so much easier to be right wing in Israel. To tell you the truth, I spoke about the Rot. I spoke, not at length, but I spoke about the Nivens. It's very, very frustrating. You know, about a month ago, when the Nivens were growing very, very, when it was very, very strong, I was in Knesset, I was in the parliament, and I started making sure, my husband is here tonight. So what we started doing is making sure that someone picks up the kids and take our eldest to the Scout, and take the little ones from the kindergarten, which is like 2 streets away from our house. Make sure that someone takes them, picks them up, and takes them by the car. Takes them by car. It's not normal. It's not normal. But this is the reality of Israel. We will probably have these challenges even when we go back into the process. And eventually we will have to go into some kind of process. But I can tell you that during the campaign, Herzog and Livni, who's very, very much experienced with negotiations with Palestinians, Livni, they were speaking about quite a long term interim agreements up until, I don't know, hopefully, final settlement will be able to kick in. Israel is a difficult country in the sense that, as I said, it's easier to be right-wing, you know. Nobody really expects you to have a solution. So you either speak about autonomy or you speak about annexation, right? That would be the two choices that, okay. One of the things I said this afternoon in another place that I was speaking at, I keep thinking, you know, during the agreement with Egypt actually included autonomy for the Palestinians. I keep thinking to myself, what would have happened if that part would have taken place at that point? Where would we be today? As I said, I don't have a crystal ball, so it's hard to guess. But it does make us a country that feels stronger with someone who's considered to be strong physically, you know? Someone who muscles up, you know, and scares people. I was also saying today, you know, when I'm trying to, when we're speaking about the fear, we're not hurt. When we're trying to say to people, listen up, if we don't go to any kind of settlement, we become a binational country. And I don't want to be a binational country. I want to be Jewish and democratic. I'm sorry. That's what my ancestors were aiming towards, right? And they came, as I said, way before. And when we were trying to say that, that's not okay, by many on the right wing. But when they're trying to scare us, that's okay. And it's so funny because just the other week I was speaking to one of my friends, and I have a lot of friends on the right wing, people that I truly love. We always know that there's somewhere that we have to stop talking. But I really admire a lot of them. Some of the, you know, really a lot of the MKs on the right are people that I really enjoy speaking to. Sometimes on the left I have trouble, right? I'm very rabbinical, if I didn't emphasize that. I'm very, very centrist. So just to wrap up the question, or I would say it was a short question, long answer. It is not easy to take back power, being on center left. It's not easy. By the way, it's a process around the world. Left is a problem, except in Greece. Their Syriza is all about, and you were asking about, do I think that we're going to have another president? As I said, I think you're going to beat us to it. And you're going to have a woman president here probably sooner than we're going to have a woman prime minister. I think that eventually women are going to rule the world. And hopefully it's going to be soon. But you know, the longer it takes, the more wars we're going to have. Yep.
Sorry.
Sorry about that. Sorry. You see, she muscled up.
I usually
She's really elbow.
yes, definitely. My name is Lynn. I'm an Israeli as well, and I applaud you for being a woman in parliament. It's hard to be a woman in Israel in general, let alone in parliament. I understand that. So thank you very much for your work. I did want to ask about one thing. Between right or left, it doesn't matter. My political affiliation is unfortunately not with you, but rather centric, or centrist. I'm not sure what the right word is. But you see, I have a problem with the rhetoric on both sides. Mainly because, and you mentioned the bill you passed about being obligated to learn Arabic, which I think is great. But what bothers me is, I think there's a lot of belief and a lot of faith and a lot of willingness for both sides to come together. But no one, either in their leadership or ours, is actually saying, okay, let's promote these A, B, C, D nonprofits. Let's get some European, US funding into the education system in extracurricular programs. Let's teach them what it is to be the other side. And some projects that are out there, I'm not saying that they're not, but there is no political backing for that.
Right.
And if you don't mind just commenting on that, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome. I think I'm very, it's very obvious, I'm very pro grassroots activities, and I think it's very, very important. I was asked today, and I'm asked all the time, what would make the change? I think economic relationships really make a difference. You see, education really makes a difference. Not just the fact that people are getting educated. It doesn't really matter, it's not that this education is not important, but the fact that people are educated. You see so many women in Nazareth building startups these days. It's amazing. I invite you, I implore you, really, please go to Nazareth. You would see amazing things. And considering the fact that Jewish women, for instance, were not allowed to drive just up until recently. So we're going somewhere. Just sometimes it's taking too much time. About a month ago, a 13-year-old kid, Palestinian kid, took a knife. Instead, a 13-year-old Israeli on his bikes, going to one of his extracurricular activities. 13-year-old kid, Israeli kid, is still hospitalized in a very bad state. I keep thinking about it, the different narratives. Our Independence Day is their Nakba. I'm not able to join hands with that. I'm not able, it's not that I don't respect their narrative. Being Zionist, I don't feel that not at this point, maybe at a later point, I'm not able to implement it in our school programs. I do think that culture must be taught our poets, which is not easy right now, because a lot of it is very nationalist. But learning the language itself, I think it's very, very important to cultivate some kind of cooperation. Obviously, I agree with you in that respect that a lot of Palestinians don't know Israelis at all. A lot of Arabs, even though they live next to Israelis, don't really know them, and vice versa, God knows. I tell my friends about Jews. I'm very, very close with the Jewish community in Israel. They're an amazing community. They have such strong ties with Israel. Nobody, very few people know about it. So how do you challenge yourself with the different narratives? I can tell you that sitting in Parliament, and I'm trying to listen to the speeches of the Joint List, I think it's very troubling. They are Palestinian Israelis, or Israeli Palestinians, or Israeli Arabs, depends on the day they wake up in the morning and the way they wake up in the morning. And all they're concerned about is Palestinians. They're not concerned at all with their community within Israel. They offend me. They offend me. They offend me. They offend my peers. I don't offend them. Some MKs would offend them. No, that's the truth. But then you feel like you're in kindergarten. And I do feel like I'm in kindergarten sometimes. That's the conflict of being in a parliament. Sometimes the only consolation I get is when I look at the British Parliament sometimes. So you get consoled by the fact that others are worse than you, but yeah, we know what consolation, what it's worth, for all it's worth. So we need to find more ways to promote these NGOs. With that, I agree. I can tell you, unfortunately, for instance, the Minister of Justice in Israel is at the moment readdressing a bill that was not passed in prior parliaments, calling for transparency in funding of countries' projects in Israel. So what Bushi Herzog said, rightfully so, he said, no problem, but transparency has to work both ways, because a lot of foreign funds are funding the purchases of houses of Arabs and projects that are very, very nationalist and very to the verge of being fascist. So it has to work both ways. Transparency, fine. We have respect for transparency, but it has to work both ways. So sometimes I wake up in the morning and I say to myself, okay, that's a bad way. That's a bad way. But it is challenging because, as I said, when you see a 13-year-old boy being stabbed, and his, his parents sending him on his bikes, to his extracurricular activity, and I went to the hospital when the 90s were very strong. I went to the hospital and I met the Rabin family, whose father was assassinated and their mother was in intensive care. They were about to leave for their father's funeral. It's terrible. You just go out in the morning and you're not sure whether or how you're going to return to your home. Richard Lakin, who died last week from his wounds after being wounded very, very badly in the bus, also about a month and a half ago. And he was a peace activist. He was a peace activist, a true peace activist. So, they're always challenging. We have a question over here. Yeah. Sorry about that. I just noticed it first. I'm sorry.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought up Richard Lakin. He grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, which is where I'm from originally, and it reminded me of the issue. I have a feeling this sort of connection to Israel, but still from a distance. And one of the things that sort of disappoints and frustrates me recently is the way I feel like Israeli Jews view American Jews. And we don't care about Israel, we don't know about Israel, we're just slaves of Obama, and that's sort of how I get the sense we're viewed as. And I'm just curious if you think there's a way to sort of arrest that trend a bit, because I think you can tell the audience here we really do care.
Yeah. Well, I'm tempted to sing Summertime, but I'll spare you. Obviously, this has been a challenging year for the relationship between America and Israel, and it's a good opportunity to apologize to you for tearing you apart. Even though I didn't personally do it, but I think it's a good chance to do it. I would say Prime Minister Netanyahu did not always make the right choices. Is that a nice diplomatic way to say it? I think the Iran deal is very, very challenging from the Israeli perspective. I'm very much concerned about the inspection. I don't speak about uranium and plutonium. I don't understand what that is. But my expertise, before I came from the business sector to the parliament, and my expertise was corporate governance. And I'm asking myself whether anything was governed before, not before the agreement was signed, when Saba were going to inspect the nuclear in Iran. But obviously, no question in my heart that President Obama stands by Israel very strongly, very firmly. As I said, Netanyahu did not think, from my perspective, he did not make the right choice in the sense that he tore you apart, in the sense that he tore the world apart, because we expect the world to be on our side. But, and that has nothing to do with America, what I'm going to say next has nothing to do with America, it has something to do with the world. I do feel that the world is hypocritical sometimes when it comes to Israel. And that is a frustrating picture. you see, we're very, very close to Syria, right? Nobody's thinking about labeling Syria's products. Everybody's ignoring the massacre, the genocide that's going on there. Millions of people being slaughtered, and the world is at a hush. Everybody's letting Putin run the show. That is terrible. That is terrible. Do you see the Security Council obsessing about Syria? I don't see that happening. I don't see that happening, and I truly regret that because I feel so sorry for the Syrian for Syrian citizens fleeing away. Look at what's going on in Europe with the refugees. Now, we're not at our best behavior, okay? Let's say we're not perfect. Far from it, okay? Is there any kind of comparison? But no, let's label the products from Israel. Let's label the products from the territories. That is, by the way, from my perspective, the worst way to fight or to push Israel to go forward with any kind of peace process. Going back to you. What's your name, by the way?
Dan.
Dan. I think it's not just we need America. I think America needs us, not even kind of, I'm not saying, oh, you need us too, because we're the only democracy in the Middle East. No. I think we share the same values, the same core values. We don't always practice them the same way. But America is also, I don't say America is not perfect. I'm not sure I'm allowed to say that, but America is not perfect. It is also a fragmented society going through several challenges. When I'm frustrated about Israel, I go to the end of the 1950s in America and the beginning of the 1960s, even before Kennedy was assassinated, which is obviously a huge tragedy in American history. But I keep saying to myself, okay, in America, in the 1950s, black people still had to sit in the back of the bus. Look where we are. So every time I'm frustrated by the course of history, that's what I remind myself. That's what I remind myself. That it did take a little bit of time, but look where we are. So that gives me a lot of hope. And I'm very, very hopeful towards the meeting of Prime Minister Netanyahu with Obama next week on Tuesday. Probably know also Jonathan Pollard is going to be released from prison after 35 years on November 20th. This is also something that had a very, very major shadow on the relationship between Israel and America for many, many years. So, although still challenging, and this coming year, you have, by the way, the best campaign I've ever seen. This is like the best joke ever. So, watching that surface, I do ask myself, what will Obama do in respect to his expectations from Israel in regards to Palestinians? That is still a question from my perspective. I don't know what he's going to be able to do. Because if he wants to root for Hillary Clinton, I don't know how strong he will push Netanyahu. And that's not so good. On the other hand, he really wants, if he wants to help her. So, challenging. Yet hopeful. Thank you, Dan. Great question.
My name is Alona, and
I'm not sure.
my name is Alona, and let's see, contextually, I'm the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor. My entire one side of my family is still in Israel, but here in America, I'm a liberal, and I have a part of my family here in America who's very Zionist and a little radical. So I'm right now soul searching, trying to figure out where do I stand on these issues. And I find myself in a very difficult place because I am also a centrist. I want peace, but there's also the real fear of, what happens after peace? Is it real? The trust, and I'm constantly not fighting with my uncle, but he's so radical,
you know, the idea of, and I'm gonna answer my question, but, you know, one of the things that really is what I'm wondering is I don't think that a lot of people understand what they're fighting about. And so he has said to me that the Palestinian idea, the people, is a fabrication, that they came, that it's just recent in the 40s and the 50s, and, you know,
1964 to be exact.
okay, so I don't know that to be true though, you know, I really, you know, so my question to you is like, so you say 1964, but I go into my own research and find that that's not necessarily true. So where do we find the truth? Everybody has their own truth. It's very, very difficult. There are histories written in different places correctly, and no one can say, oh, I'm right, and it's written here, because the other person can say, well, the fact is that it's here, and it could take years for us to prove each other correctly, you know? So it is very, very
Thank you
difficult
for
work.
the interesting and complex question. Thank you. I do, no, seriously. The PLO was established in 1964. There were Arabs in Israel, in Zion, or in Palestine, depends on the narrative. Before that, way before that, my grandparents were in Safed in 1777. They lived next to the Arabs. They spoke fluent Arab. Okay, there was not an issue, except for a few pogroms. Nothing was, you know, nothing was too bad. It's true. It's true. That is challenging. But what Rabin, that was why what Rabin decided to do in the 1993 Oslo Accord. Initially, it was so great because he decided to kind of waiver any kind of context. There weren't Palestinians, there were Palestinians. You know, he said, you know, just give that all away, give that up, that discussion, put it away, put it aside. No relevance, sort of. He didn't like Arafat. Oh my God, he did not like him. But he decided that something needs to be done. You know, there's something about Israel, you know, about the neighborhood that we're in, that if you get stuck in the mud and you don't pull yourself out of the mud, you just get stuck and stuck and stuck. You know, like what do they call them? The swamps in the south. Quicksand or no, the Mississippi. So if you just get stuck and stuck, you know, that's the Middle East. That's one of our problems with the fact that no negotiations are taking place in the past years. Because I think that's very much not to the benefit of Israel, in the sense that I don't want anybody to twist my arm. I don't want anybody to twist my arm. Unless it's nice and not painful, which is usually not the case. You know, in South Africa, after the apartheid, they did something very, very brave. I don't think we're going to be able to do that because it's a different situation. And I spoke at length to African journalists just very recently in Israel. They had a huge delegation coming to Israel, journalists from all over Africa. It was fascinating to listen to them, not just to speak with them, but to listen to them. And in South Africa, they had a committee that was called Reconciliation and the Truth. And basically what they were doing was kind of clearing the air, speaking about everything that went on during the years of apartheid. We're not there. I don't think we'll be able to be there because it's different. You know, this was really people. It's different. It's a different situation. It's a different situation. But you know, if I'm allowed to dream, you know, everybody will give up their own claims in the sense that we will be able to be a safe Jewish country, a safe Jewish state, democratic. They will have their own state. It's not that I'm rooting for the two-state solution. I just don't see any other solution. Someone asked me today, could you know, if you could portray to the right wing, what would a binational state would mean demographically? I'm not able to portray it to them because, you know, I understand it's Professor Shlomo Ben-Ami was recently here. He was a minister in the Israeli government many years ago, and a professor of poli-science, one of the most important ones. And he said, you know, if you want to know what a binationalist country is denying. So I don't think we're aiming for that. I don't think we're aiming for that. I think with any process that will take place, we will have very, very strong security challenges. You know, I remember something going to places where buses exploded, and it was terrible. We went to see, by the way, most of the buses that exploded was Iran's work, Islamic Jihad, that was nurtured by Iran in those years. Still is in many ways. Now it's Hezbollah, north. So, and you think about ISIS taking down an airplane in Sinai. Can you imagine that? And just all over the place. That's ISIS, that's the Islamic country. And everybody's pointing a finger at Israel. So, on the one hand, I say to myself, okay, we need to make an effect. We need to make a difference. We need to be proactivists, to be proactive. On the other hand, you say to yourself, oh my God, let's just shut ourselves down. You know, I remember during last year, during Protective Edge. You know what my kids had to do? We lived in the heart of Tel Aviv, and their kindergarten was in a very, very, very old house. They didn't have a shelter. Now, you could not go to work forever, right? There were missiles shooting over Tel Aviv. And you know, the Iron Dome is also basically a missile shooting another missile, right? So parts of them, you never know which part's gonna, God forbid, fall on your head. So my kids, who were at that time 3-year-old, they were taught to be beetles, right? To be ladybugs, you know, to just put their hands on their heads and just 3-year-old kids. 3-year-old kids. I would say about Israel, the Middle East, I would say that's probably the best way to portray hope for the best except for the worst way. We have to expect everything in this region that we are. That's why America is so important to us. And America's Jewry, Dan, by the way, is very, very important to us. It's not that you give us legitimacy. I think we're a legitimate country anyway. But it is the strong ties and the fact that you're watching out for us as well makes us stronger. Okay? Makes us stronger. Any other questions? Yeah.
Okay, last question. Yes, thank you.
We have the time czar here.
Hey, what is it?
Here.
So a lot of people in this room probably know that the tech startups is the second most in the world. Do you think the Israeli government can do more to promote that, to change the PR battle? Just the innovation that comes out of Israel.
Sorry.
It's amazing. But a lot of the media focuses on the conflict. And if the Israeli government started to shift the PR battle towards the innovation, the life savings, with all the medical advancements, not just like security software, but also medical, agricultural. Do you think that the government's focusing on the wrong topics?
What's your name?
Adam.
Do you work with Israel?
No.
Oh, okay. Thank you for this question. I think, oh my God, are we trying to point towards those directions? Netanyahu actually gave an interesting speech in the UN about a month and a half ago, and he was speaking about the Israeli startups. We're trying to invest a lot of money in promoting tourism to Israel. I mean, Israel is such a beautiful country. It's growing beautiful by the day. We are working very, very hard on exposing what we're doing. I mean, so, even if you go to Nazareth, as I said before, you go to Beersheba, where it's, basically it's the cyber capital of the world nowadays. And not that it's the only homeland security and stuff like that, it's the only thing that's important. As you said, medical devices, medicine, agriculture. Amazing. I come, my family actually, my father started off with a very, very small kind of factory that now exports to 75 countries in the world, agricultural, irrigation accessories and desalination accessories. And that's mature industry, right? It's not but even mature industry is like, in high-tech kind of way, producing in high-tech kind of way. Israeli really is so, it's amazing. Just imagine, it'd be funny to say, do you remember the 2008 financial rundown? I mean, obviously, here, Israel went through it like. On the other hand, at the moment, growth in Israel is growing a bit slow. So that's concerning. That's concerning. That's why we're so concerned about labeling, about BTS, about things like that, that makes export so much harder. But I think government has nothing to do. Government is trying to aim there. But people don't always want to listen. People don't always want to listen. In that respect, I think our family in America, it's very, very important that you echo that. That you tell people, it's okay to go to Israel. It's amazing. I mean, people come to Israel and they're like, oh my God. It's not so, it's not what we see on CBS, on BBC, on Fox, well, Fox not. Fox is okay. But it's, it's amazing to be there. It is, I really, I'm not sure if you understood, but I really love Israel. It's fantastic. It's fantastic. But it is challenging. So, but probably that's part of the beauty of it, So the government, by the way, is investing a lot of money in promoting startups nowadays, in promoting mature industry, which from my perspective is very, very important. I actually had caucus the lobby for Israeli industry because I find it very, very important. It's very, very important in order to strengthen the Israeli economy. So, it's amazing to think that in the beginning of the 1990s, we were still a developing country. By the way, it's good and bad that we're not a developing country anymore, but we are developed, economy-wise. But can you imagine that our ratings is so high, for a country of that size, of that scale. So there are a lot of good things going on. And I hope more people will be willing to hear.
Thank you very, very much. I feel that an opportunity how tired you are because no one could tell. Thank you for that, really those inspirational remarks.
I'm not tired anymore. Don't
say that because now they're going to hit you with more questions. And thank you again to Tammy and the DCJCC. And a personal thank you to Alexis Schwartz, for helping make this happen. And thank you to Masad Israel. They're outside. They have a table with all the amazing programs there are to come to the wonderful Israel that Ayelet spoke about. So please, what? Including all those tech programs. Thank you, Tammy. So please feel free to walk through the Masad table and check out the programs. And last but by no means least, Rinat and Tamir are here. And we really encourage you to stay for the discussion groups. They will be taking place right where the reception was and where the exhibit was. Please stay with us for the discussion groups. I think we have a lot of stuff to discuss following this fascinating program, if I don't say so myself. Thank you very much to everyone, and thanks for coming tonight.